possibility of extending that transition period. We may get into that. I'll leave it to you. In terms of our ability to discharge our functions, there's a couple of aspects of the withdrawal agreement are relevant. It improves our ability to discharge our function relative to having no deal. It addresses in a clear way for the period of the withdrawal agreement, covered by the withdrawal agreement, a series of transition issues that we've highlighted as the FPC. Specifically, we can go into those if you want, but I'll just leave it at the aggregate. It continues the supervisory cooperation, the resolution cooperation arrangements that we have currently with European authorities, which is absolutely essential given the size and complexity of the UK financial system. And it we would expect, and this is something we will give greater view on when we provide a response to your letter, we would expect that it would support economic outcomes. I would note, of course, that the forecast contained in the inflation report assumes not the specific withdrawal agreement, but assumes a smooth transition to an average of outcomes. So that gives some idea of the direction of the forecast, and obviously better economic performance helps the bank discharge both its monetary and financial stability responsibilities. But why don't I leave it there?
Okay. Thank you. And we will come back to this point about, I'm sure, the transition period and some of the details. Just in high level, on the steps of Downing Street last week, the Prime Minister talked about 3 potential scenarios. She talked about the withdrawal agreement, leaving with no deal, or no Brexit at all. In the analysis that you're going to provide to Parliament, are you going to look at those 3 different scenarios?
We're not intending to provide additional analysis on the 3rd scenario, which is no Brexit at all. On the basis of the communication from the TSC, we will look at the following, which is a no deal, no transition Brexit. But I would stress that is work that the FPC does, and as I think committee members know, the job of the FPC is not to look for how things could go well under that scenario, but what could go wrong. So that will be a worst-case scenario of no deal, no transition Brexit, because our job is to make sure that the system, the financial system, is able to withstand any shocks associated with that. So there will be that analysis, and there will be commentary that comes out as part of the financial stability report and in our response to the TSC related to that specific issue. Secondly, as in response to your letter, we will look at, as the MPC, a scenario related to the withdrawal agreement. I say scenario as opposed to a full forecast because I think, I may be proven wrong, but I think that the political declaration, about which we're going to hear more relatively soon, will still have a range of potential outcomes, still very important things that could be negotiated. So it's not a point forecast. So we have to make some assumptions about how that could come out, and I would expect that there would be a range of potential outcomes in that scenario. Again, forgive me if I'm saying in the conditional, because we as the MPC, and we're not all represented here today, as you know, we're working through that right now on an accelerated timetable, so that's what we'll provide. Then you will be able to, as a committee, you will be able to reference both of those blocks of work relative to our November forecast and relative to a simple baseline, which is the forecast prior to the referendum, which was just a trend, effectively, of that forecast. The last thing, and maybe I could just use this opportunity to check, in your letter to me, you referenced a scenario which was a transition to WTO. And so our assumption has been that we should look at that. If I may, the work we're doing thus far suggests that the principal value of looking at that is it demonstrates the importance of some of the assumptions that have to be made. And I'll end with this, which I'll put a fine point on it. The question has to be that in 20 months, it's a question in some respects Parliament TSC is better informed on, but in 20 months, would we be ready to have in place all the custom arrangements and other arrangements that are necessary for a WTO trading relationship with the European Union? that's a question. You have to make assumptions about that.
Yeah.
Depending on the assumptions you make. Transition to WTO could look more like no deal, no transition, or it could look more like a seamless move to WTO. But we'll just expose all that so you can have a proper assessment of it.
Thank you. Okay, well, and we will obviously just reflect on that further as well. And you touched on the political declaration there, and I think you probably answered, but you will incorporate the political declaration as far as
we
possible.
can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I wanted, Mr. Haldane, if I could just turn to you about the implications of the draft agreement for the existing economic forecast of the bank and the committees. Is that still valid as an existing economic forecast?
Well, I think pending that further detail from the political declaration, our November forecasts remain our best guess as to how the economy might evolve. You'll have seen within that, in our last inflation report, that there is already some signs over the past month or two of uncertainties around a cliff edge, around a no deal, having begun to have a more material impact on the investment plans of business. So our own agents' intelligence from companies around the country suggests that as we got nearer to the point of withdrawal, that has had a more material adverse impact on some companies' investment plans than has been the case hitherto. Brexit uncertainty is the single largest headwind that they identified in our most recent survey conducted during September and October. So, notwithstanding the fact that the details of the deal remain to be agreed, we are seeing somewhat greater impact on the behaviour of companies in particular over the last month or two. That could make for a somewhat weaker fourth quarter than we saw in the third quarter, and certainly a more volatile path for output, I think, over the next few months.
Okay. And this might not be something you're able to set out now. It might be something you'll set out in the work back to us.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what major judgments you need to take in order to model the economic impact of the withdrawal agreement? I mean, in terms of the assumptions that need to be made, the things that are still, require a judgment because they cannot be certain.
Well, the two key elements of that are what is the end state, as the Governor mentioned. Our current working assumption, which has actually served us pretty well hitherto, has been to take some average of an EEA, free trade agreement, and WTO set of possible arrangements. The political declaration will enable us to focus somewhat precisely on what that end state will be, and that will be helpful, and that will possibly reframe our forecasts to some degree. The other key aspect is the path of transition to that end state, where our working assumption so far has been of a rather gradual 15-year transition to that end state. And it could be that's another aspect we need to look at ahead of producing our analysis for you on the 29th of this month.
Okay. Yes, Governor. Yes.
Yeah. Can I just pick up where Mr. Haldane left off on a couple of points? First is that the analysis we will give you is a scenario over our policy horizons. So think, 3, we can stretch it out to 5 years, but it's not something that others would produce. For example, the Treasury, which is the long-term comparative static.
The government analysis as well.
Exactly. First point. Second, what is relevant to those longer terms, or what we're transitioning to, will include questions such as the level of services access, which, including on financial services, so how much autonomous equivalence is granted, would be another example. With respect to trade, the nature of the trading arrangements in goods, is it pure free trade? Are there rules of origins requirements? What frictions? Again, some of those things, they're very relevant to and of course what third country trade deals are put in place, they're relevant to the long term. You'll see less of them in our forecast because the impact happens more off stage, so it's something you're transitioning to. But we will as I say, expose the ones that are relevant so you can take stock of the various effects.
Just so 2 final questions before I hand on to Charlie. Governor, you said repeatedly, most recently on press conference following the inflation report, that a no-deal Brexit is an unlikely tail scenario. Do you still hold that view? And has the chance of a no-deal risen in your mind?
Well, it's we're going to find out relatively soon. So it's never a good idea.
Some of us may or may not.
Some of you may know already. No, we're going to find out relatively soon. I think the important thing is from a financial policy committee perspective, not represented here today, but from our perspective on the FPC is we've always operated from the view that this might happen. It might be very unlikely. It might happen. So get the system prepared for that. And we've been preparing for it since the day after the referendum, effectively. We're quietly confident that we have in place all the measures we could have in place. There's a few things that are working their way through Parliament, and Parliament has acted with alacrity and responsibility, I would say, on the most important statutory instruments, and so this is moving through. There's one major issue with the Europeans, which is making progress but is not fully resolved. We can come to that if that's necessary. But certainly next week in our report to you, with the stress test, we will provide as much information as is needed to make judgments about the capital and liquidity position of the core of the banking system. So, from a probability perspective, even if it's a very, very low probability, the FPC is operated on, we have to get the system ready. From an MPC perspective, the forecasts in the November inflation report does not include a no-deal scenario. It's always had a no-deal, no-transition scenario. It's always had a smooth transition to an average of end states. By the time we make our next forecast, we will, which is February, full forecast, which is February, we will have to incorporate where we're headed.
Okay. And then just finally, so John, I wanted to ask you about the impact of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration on the stability and continuity of financial services. Do you have a view on that? Obviously, those 3 paragraphs in the political declaration on financial services. What's your thinking on that at the moment?
Well, the first part I make is just to re-emphasise what the Governor has said. A transition period is something the FPC made clear very early on will be valuable because it reduces disruption and it reduces financial stability risk. I mean, as you know, we've been preparing for financial stability risk on the basis of no deal, no transition. But clearly, if there's a transition period, there is more time to deal with some of the issues I think that you're well aware of. The other point I'd make is that within those 3 paragraphs on financial services is a commitment to agree on equivalence arrangements by June of 2020. Now, clearly, the transition period is more effective in reducing disruption if people know the end state. Yeah. So knowing the end state by June 2020, whatever it is, I think gives a certainty to what you're transitioning to, which at the moment we haven't had, and which has been actually, I think, some of the cause of the risks we're trying to manage.
Is that a realistic time, June 2020?
I think it depends. The equivalence arrangements exist at the moment within the European Union. They're being changed at the moment within the European Union. I expect those changes to go through before March of this year in some areas like market infrastructure. But of course we start with the same arrangements in those areas. So my view is that should be possible. The question then is, can one expand equivalence in the way that the white paper suggested, the Czech white paper suggested? That may take longer, but I think if both parties have expressed an aspiration and a will to do it by June 2020.
If they want to do it, they could.
Then they want to do it, then I think that's good. The other thing I'd mention from financial stability point of view is that the political declaration also has within it the ambition to reach a decision on data adequacy by the end of 2020, and that's another financial stability risk that we've been concerned about. And clearly, if there is a data adequacy decision by that point, it reduces the risks to banks, financial institutions here and within the EU on transfer of data, which is essential to their operations. More broadly, though, on the type of equivalence and what it will look like and the extent to which it resembles the Chequers white paper. I think it's too early. It's too early to say. I can give you a view based on what's in the white paper, but within the political declaration, as we have it now, it's only 3 paragraphs.
Okay, that's very helpful. Charlie.
Thank you. Governor, I was looking at the movements in sterling last week as the Cabinet meeting went on, and sterling fell quite sharply. And then when the Prime Minister came out and made her announcement, it rose very sharply, and the Prime Minister announced Cabinet support for the draft withdrawal agreement. What was not known at that time is that the Brexit Secretary had told the Chief Whip about his intention to resign. The bank has considerable experience in handling the releasing of market-sensitive information. Do bank procedures require the release of all relevant information in a market-sensitive matter at the same time? And what is the impact on the integrity of financial markets of releasing market-sensitive information in a piecemeal way?
Well, I'm not familiar with the minute-by-minute discussions, cabinet after cabinet discussions to which may have occurred, to which you refer, the extent to which those discussions were final. These are personal issues in terms of sometimes people have intentions and those intentions aren't followed through. And there is, in government, as in central banking, there is always market-sensitive information, and the important thing is that there is multiple elements of market-sensitive information, and the important thing is that is released in as comprehensive way as possible. But the individual decisions, I would think, I'm not familiar with the specifics of it, but I would view that as totally understandable at the pace with which it came out, and I would also think that it's something that the foreign exchange market can and did handle. If I could bring it up to the general in terms of the foreign exchange markets, as you know, implied volatility in sterling is very high right now, much higher than it is for other major currencies, for the obvious reasons of the stakes of the political discussions you're all involved in, and the importance for the outlook for the economy in the short and medium term. And so the expectation of those who are active in those markets is that they're volatile, that it will continue to be volatile for the next month at least. You can see that in the term structure of volatility in those markets, and there will be events that move sterling up and others that move sterling down, and that will continue. That will likely to continue to happen for the next little while.
And what we do know, if the chief executive of a company told the company secretary, I'm going to resign, and the chairman made a statement to the market that all was fine, we know that would be a serious matter. Should there be announcements on Cabinet's views on draft agreement and all that sort of thing, could it be better handled from the perspective of financial market integrity, particularly with the risk of further resignations from members of the Cabinet who apparently enjoy eating pizza?
Many people enjoy eating pizza, Mr. Elphick. I think I watched the Prime Minister's remarks from Downing Street. I think I clocked on the word collective, as I think a number of other observers did. Not everybody would have picked up the important subtlety there, the collective decision of the Cabinet as opposed to the unanimous decision of Cabinet. And I had no information about the position of people going into the meeting or certainly what transpired during the meeting, which finished just before she came out and made her statement, which was an accurate, to my knowledge, representation of what Cabinet had collectively decided. So in that regard, it was perfectly appropriate, and recall as well, as you would appreciate, that the Prime Minister, at an important point like that, has a felt a duty and a responsibility to speak directly to the nation, so not just the markets, but the nation, about what had transpired. And she did so, from what I can see, my understanding of the timeline, as quickly as she possibly could have after the completion of the meeting. I'll say one other thing, if I could, which is that your analogy to an announcement by a company or an announcement by a central bank or a press release by the TSC on something that could be market sensitive. A decision's taken, and then you sit down and you write a press release, a representation of there is a lag between the decision and the event and then the communication of it. You have to, one looks to shorten that, but what one also looks for is that those in possession of that material information, knowledge of that decision, keep it to themselves and obviously don't act on it, and that's the key. That's the key test.
And turning to wider Brexit issues, given the current state of knowledge, are you more likely to vote for stimulus or rate rises in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, it depends. It's a very important question, and it's something that we, as the Monetary Policy Committee, have addressed at various times, but fairly comprehensively in the inflation report. Is something that we'll also address in communication to you next week. It depends on the implications of no deal for supply, demand, and the exchange rate and the balance of those. We may get into this in more detail. You said keep your answers short, so since it's in the inflation report, I'll just make one point in this respect, which is that 2 points. One is that this would be a very unusual situation. It is very rare to see a large negative supply shock in an advanced economy. You have to stretch back, at least in our analysis, to the 70s to find analogies, there is some information about what happened to New Zealand with the end of Commonwealth preferences, but only some information. There's some information from the oil shock of the early 70s, but only some information. So it's an unusual situation. And my second point quickly is that the initial conditions, the starting position of this economy is very different than it was at the referendum. We have inflation above target, then we had it barely above zero. We have the economy basically operating at full capacity, maybe in slight excess demand, when then there was excess supply. And we have, at the end, the primacy of the inflation target in our remit. So we can stretch the horizon a bit over which we return inflation to target, but in the end, we're charged by Parliament statutory responsibility to bring inflation back to target. Okay, so
before the referendum results, the MPC emphasised that policy response could also be in either direction. And just a week after, you then gave a speech in which you said monetary policy should ease. What was it you learned in that week that decided you on that?
A couple of things. One was that sterling adjusted, but it didn't adjust by the extent it might have. There was a apparent sharp hit to demand and confidence, and so the prospect of a much bigger gap between demand and supply in the economy had increased. Inflation expectations held in as well. So all of that set up a situation where we had a trade-off. There was excess supply in the economy, the prospect of more of it if we had an adjusted policy. We had inflation below target, and so we made the adjustment. We had inflation below target at that point, but prospectively above target, and that is what happened because of as we expected, the pass-through of the exchange rate move. So it was a considered judgment, but again, it provides a case study, if you will, that says, yeah, it could go either way, because in that case, the demand shock far outweighed any impact on supply over the course of the next few years. And as I say, the exchange rate, while it adjusted, it held in, as did inflation expectations, gave us the flexibility to provide stimulus, and we think that was part of the reason why the economy grew as it did.
And then after the referendum, households such as those I represent in Dover and Deal were bullish, had increased confidence because they believed in Britain, they believed in our future as an independent nation, whereas financial markets, big business, took the opposite viewpoint, and that resulted in a fall in the value of sterling. If that gap in sentiment were to occur after a no-deal Brexit, what would the implications be for economic and price stability?
So I want to be a little careful in getting into a straight hypothetical, but if the economy moved further into excess demand because the weight of spending either was maintained or accelerated, and we had the prospect of additional inflation because financial markets looking at, in their judgment, but their judgment that future relative incomes would be lower, and therefore you needed a change in the relative price of the exchange rate and some other assets, that sterling were to depreciate, so therefore there was more inflationary pressure in the economy at a time when we had some expectation, and we can discuss this and probably in more detail when we provide our coming testimony, some expectation of supply being reduced for a period of time. That's a situation where you would expect, at least I would expect, that monetary policy would be tightened.
Okay, and so in the event of a no-deal Brexit, should households and businesses be prepared for sharp interest rate rises on top of any fallout from Brexit itself?
What households and businesses should expect is the following. They should expect that their financial system is there to serve them just as it is today, and we'll make sure that that is the case. They should expect that we will manage monetary policy to achieve our 2% inflation target, and subject to that, provide as much support as we can to the economy to help it through a period of adjustment. That's what they should expect. If I may, Mr. Elphick, the issues around Brexit, particularly around a no-deal, no-transition Brexit, we have a role. We have roles, the two roles I just outlined. But the real action, if you will, the real issues are going to be in the real economy. So they'll be about how well the logistics system works, where business confidence is, what access, if any, is there in a true no-deal, no-transition Brexit. This is not the financial crisis round two, where the Bank of England and other central banks were center stage. This is a real economy shock, and therefore central banks have a role, but we're more of, we're more of a sideshow.
But let me just press you a little harder. Would interest rates be higher or lower, do you think?
That depends on the balance of demand, supply, and the exchange rate, as the committee has made clear. We could see either scenario.
So it could be more stimulus. Low rates.
There are scenarios where that could happen, but to be clear, those are scenarios where the hit to demand, so the level of activity, is greater than the impact on the supply capacity of the economy. Both of those are going down. So it depends on your definition of net stimulus.
Can we just ask for views from other members of the Mr. Saunders? What's your view on Mr. Elphick's questions?
Well, I think the framework for the MPC, how we would respond, is the same as it was in 2016, supply, demand and exchange rate. As the Governor said, the conditions that we face now are different to 2016. Then there was spare capacity in the economy, now there's not. Then inflation started below target, now it's slightly above. And so you can't automatically assume that the policy response would be the same. I say the other key point is that an early move to WTO with no transition would be a major negative supply shock for the UK economy, and there's really very little that monetary policy can do to offset that. If you have queues at Dover, the answer is not lower interest rates.
So John or Mr Haldane, do you have anything to add on
No,
the issues that raised?
I subscribe as a member of the MPC to the framework we've set out. I'd only add one point. What's also important here is not just what the outcome is, but how the outcome measures up against the expectations of households and businesses and the foreign exchange markets. So will households increase their spending in a certain outcome? Will they reduce it? And we can't know that. We can see some of the effects of Brexit in the economy now, but you can't be precise now about how particular Brexit outcomes and paths to those outcomes will measure up against people's expectations and what their behaviour afterwards will be. I think it is an unprecedented situation, and it's one the MPC will have to judge carefully at the time.
Mr Haldane?
I think my colleagues have covered it off pretty comprehensively. I mean, the only point I'd underscore, I mean, Michael and the Governor both mentioned the difference in initial conditions of the economy relative to the referendum. Another key difference is that after the referendum, it was merely the expectation of some disruption, potentially, to the supply side of the economy. And this would be the reality of some disruption to the supply side of the economy, whether it's at the ports or more broadly. And that does change the monetary policy calculus and the way the Governor described. It does mean we would most likely see some immediate and possibly sizable hit to the supply side in addition to the demand side, and that does make for a different monetary policy recommendation potentially.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on. Rushnara.
Good morning. I wanted to start off with some questions about the EU withdrawal agreement. Wouldn't you agree, Chancellor, and this has come up in the past, that... Sorry, Governor.
Change of...
Giving you a new job. Governor.
Provide benefits for everyone.
Maybe we'll need you to be Governor
on
at some point as well. Wouldn't you agree that we are being left between a rock and a hard place, ultimately?
Ultimately, under the withdrawal
Under the EU withdrawal agreement or a potential no-deal scenario?
Well, I wouldn't subscribe to that characterization and I go back maybe if I could to my opening comments, which is there is value in transition, clearly value in transition, and just reference the exchange that was just had. Of course, it matters to what future economic partnership the country is transitioning to, and so that makes the political declaration that much more important, and not just what's on the page, but what ultimately the intent of what's on the page and what could be negotiated.
Okay, and just in terms of given the events of last week, of course, when the Prime Minister made her announcement about the collective agreement, that was, that certainly for some of us seemed like the calm before the storm. And the storm came on Thursday. And it became clear in the Commons that there isn't a clear majority for the Prime Minister's EU withdrawal agreement, and certainly not for a no-deal situation. In the event of neither of those, in the event of that happening, what are the implications for the decisions the Bank of England makes, and implications for interest rates and inflation? Do you see that scenario leading to having to move towards pressing ahead with dealing with a potential no-deal scenario? So is that where you would end up having to do more preparation? And
clear on the scenario you're painting? You're saying a scenario where there's either no deal or no agreement?
Well, the political reality is that there isn't a majority in the House for the EU withdrawal agreement that the Prime Minister's presented, and it's been made very clear in the House that the vast majority of members won't want a no-deal situation. The Prime Minister's ruled out extending Article 50. She's also ruled out a public vote. So where does that leave the country? And where does that leave your preparation in terms of thinking about what we do? And given the constraints that have already been mentioned about the limited room for manoeuvre in terms of interest rates and inflation and some of the actions that were taken in 2016, you may not have at your disposal to be able to deploy in a similar way. What would you do in that situation?
Well, I obviously defer to you as a parliamentarian and ultimately to Parliament on what the range of plausible scenarios are for either the transition or the future relationship. So make no judgment around that. And so from an MPC's perspective, we will deal with the outcome of that process and how it affects the judgments and spending judgments of businesses, households, the impact on financial market prices and what it means for inflation, and then set policy appropriately. From an FPC perspective, all of these discussions, just valid discussions in Parliament, just reinforce the importance of what we are, what we have been preparing for, and the degree of preparation there. I will say the one thing I will say is that the in terms of our forecast that's embedded in the November inflation report, it's based on a range of outcomes. The upper end of that range is something more akin to, not exactly akin to, but something more akin to the status quo.
Would anyone else like to comment? Sir John.
Like is a... Bluntly, there will be a Brexit outcome. Yeah. It will be one of the outcomes, you suggest, and we'll know within a few months, which it is. There may be further uncertainties down the track, but we either will leave the European Union on the 29th of March next year or not. It's not for us to say which is the right outcome from a central bank point of view, and I think Parliament and government will decide how to take that forward. It's our job to be prepared for the worst. We've gone into some detail about how we're doing that, and to provide for Parliament any information relative to our mandate that's useful, and we will do that. And I think the other thing that's important, as the Governor said, is to stress that whatever the outcomes, people in the UK can have assurance that they won't see a financial sector meltdown of the sort they saw in 2008, and that the bank is there to deliver the inflation objective from an institutional point of view, and they can have trust in the institution doing its job. But how the outcomes will play out and the choices, I think, I defer to Parliament and Government.
Thank you.
I have the impression from talking to businesses, and I think this is consistent with what we hear from the agents, is that most businesses are not prepared for a no-deal Brexit.
Are not prepared?
Yeah. And don't know really how to prepare. And what we've seen over the last month or two, as that risk has become more visible, is some weakness in business confidence and rising uncertainty among businesses.
Mm-hmm. So could you just speak up a little bit?
Sorry.
That's
sorry.
Right. Yeah. So you were saying, just to finish that sentence off.
Yeah, sorry.
As
the risk of a no-deal Brexit has become more visible recently, we've seen business confidence weaken and rising uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that may have some effect on near-term economic activity, a negative effect.
Yeah. So I'm just going to move on to the text agreement, which suggests that the transition period may be extended to quote 20XX. Does that concern you, Governor?
Well, it narrows it down. Does it concern? No. I would say about this, about the option to extend the transition period, I'm sure it's there for a reason. Since it's in there, it would appear wise to very carefully and objectively and transparently consider how long it is likely to take to negotiate the new economic partnership, all aspects of that new partnership, which aren't entirely limited to economic, actually, but all aspects of that partnership, and implement it. And if I can just give a reference point, which is that if you look on average for a trade deal, from sort of start to finish on average, something on the order of 4 years. And the implementation period tends to be a little more than half of that period of time. and if I can add one other point, which is that obviously in a negotiation, it's always valuable to look at what are the constraints on the other side. I think we all know that European parliamentary elections in the spring. My experience, Sir John has much more, but my experience of dealing with the European Commission over the years has been that not much happens for that period of time in the run-up to the election, and several months afterwards as all the rolls are restacked, and that is square in the middle of the transition period. So there is a very limited window to negotiate. So, but again, the government and others will have a much better sense of how much progress has been made on that future economic partnership already, and therefore how much more needs to be done. Last point, if I may, in terms of preparations, we've talked, Mr. Saunders just referenced business preparation, and I would agree with his comments. But there's also the preparation of the border force, HMRC, the extremely difficult, very complex, in many respects unprecedented jobs that they've been asked to do. It would appear, the question has to be again, will our customs and excise and other procedures be ready at the end of that period of time as well?
Yeah, so from what you're saying, it's clear that the period of transition is likely to will need to be extended, and there will be a cost implication to that. It's already set at 39 billion. So if we extend it further and further, what would be the assessment of that? Will that be something that you'll be able to come back to us?
Well, it's
because our constituents will want to know what we're getting in return, whether you're on the leave side of the argument or remain side of the argument. What are the costs, and what are we getting in return at the moment? What they can see is that we're going to be rule takers. What we're being offered is much worse than what we have at the moment. So what would be the cost of continuing to extend that period?
So the question for others to answer is, what is the, is it realistic to negotiate that future partnership such that the economy moves to it at the start of January 2021? And to make an objective, informed assessment of that.
It's not, is it? That's what
as
you're
I
saying.
say, it's rather. I'll say this from a financial sector perspective. There has been substantial preparation already. There's been substantial transition already. There's one area which we can go into on the unclear derivative side where we don't think the market itself can solve the issue, even over a additional 20-month period. But largely accepting that, we would say that with cooperation with European authorities, the financial sector could be fully transitioned over the course of that 20-month period. That's not. It's not clear that is true for all sectors. First point, and secondly, the judgment about the ability to negotiate, a proper, comprehensive trade deal in that horizon. I know some people think it's very easy, but you're making big decisions about trading off access in various areas. You're making decisions about potentially unprecedented frameworks for access for services.
Yep.
And then there is just the logistical challenges, which again others can answer. I know you have the head of the HMRC coming in tomorrow, so
we'll ask him about that.
They will have a better
do you have a
perspective.
final question?
I've got a final question. But basically, in conclusion, it's going to cost significantly more than the 39 billion if we have to extend that period, because within that period it's unlikely that we'll get a trading agreement, and if the government couldn't do it in the last couple of years, then it doesn't bode well. In terms of investment, in November you stated that business investment fell by 1% in the first 6 months of this year, and they need clarity of the future trading relationship. Does the draft agreement provide that clarity?
2 points, if I may. On the cost, again, it's for others to answer, but I just note if there's a cost for the extension, it's most properly weighed against the economic return derived from paying that cost, which is not just during the period of time. Well, it would appear that there would be, given public comments, and but again, it's truly for the Chancellor. I'll leave it for the Chancellor to answer that.
Apologies. I'm still recovering from the session that he
in terms of business investment. There has been a clear effect of uncertainty on business investment. For what it's worth, the most recent ONS numbers for the third quarter show another fall in business investment, broadly consistent with our surveys, discussions of the agents, etc. What an agreement, an agreement, particularly one with transition, and which had some expectation of a deep economic partnership in the fullness of time, would provide greater clarity for business, and would provide one would expect that would support investment over time. Now, we will put a scenario. We're in the process of putting a scenario together, which just assumes that is what happens, as per the request of the TSC. So we'll give you some more precise orders of magnitude of that next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wes.
Good morning. And after your impression of the Chancellor, Governor, of cuts and taxes, spend more money, we should ask the Chancellor to do an impression of you next time he comes in front of the committee to get his own back. But I think you'll forgive me. Obviously, we're here to discuss the inflation report, but I think you'll forgive me, Governor and Sir John, if I just ask you some questions around some of the financial stability risks and mitigations, given what's going on in Parliament and the state of the negotiations. The statement released by the FPC following its meeting last month escalated your appeals to EU authorities to take steps to mitigate risks to financial stability in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Obviously, since then, the Commission and ESMA have made announcements regarding temporary reprieves to interest rate and credit derivatives and access to UK clearinghouses. But I wondered if, in your view, this amounts to the pressing and timely action that the FPC called for. Governor, maybe start with you.
I'll start, and I'm sure Sir John will add. Pardon me. We welcome the announcements by the Commission, by ESMA. Those are definitely steps in the right direction. I think it's important to recognize up front, though, that these decisions around cleared derivatives are first and foremost decisions taken by the private entities, the clearinghouses themselves, who have to look after the risks to all of their members, the risk to the clearinghouse, the risk to all of their members of operating outside of the law. And that goes to the next point, which is in our discussions with those clearinghouses, what is clear to us is, not surprisingly, that they are looking for a form of legal certainty. Now, we're on a path towards greater legal certainty, but they don't yet have the clarity on the mechanism or precision around that that would provide greater legal certainty, that they could continue to operate, they continue to be recognized absent a deal. We're obviously talking about absent a deal. And they don't have a sense of the scope of derivatives that would be covered, or the time frame discussed as temporary specifically. But John, do you want to?
No, first I'd say I think the movement by the European Union is welcome. And I think Vice President Dombrovskis said that the work, the technical track work between the ECB and the Bank of England had enabled them to sort of understand the issue more clearly. So I think the issue is now understood quite well. But as the Governor says, and I think I said this committee a few weeks ago, if you're on the board of a clearinghouse and you can't be sure that a proportion of your members will be able to perform their obligations in what is a risk management, risk mutualisation business, and you're not sure whether you will be subject to civil or possibly criminal penalties, you look for sufficient certainty to enable you not to take the action you could take, which is to ask those members to leave. So I think we're some way down that track. As the Governor says, it's first and foremost for the clearinghouses themselves and for their legal advisors, but I think they'll want to know the scope, the timescale, the processes, and the conditions, because the European Commission notice said there would be conditions on this temporary commission. So they would want to be able to see essentially the legislation, what it does, how they apply, and they'll have to apply to ESMAs for recognition. But certainly the recognition of the issue, I thought, was welcome.
Recognition of the issue, but are you reassured that these proposals will contain the financial stability risks that you've identified, or do you think they need to go further?
If the European Union grants a temporary equivalence decision under the current MA legislation, and if ESMA recognises the clearinghouses so that they can continue to operate with European clients after the clearinghouses after 29 March, yes.
Okay.
If those actions are taken, yes.
And turning to your discussions with your European counterparts, have you discussed the FPC statement, the escalation of language you've used around no deal, and do you think there's now agreement across the technical working group between the ECB and the Bank of England on the actions needed to mitigate the risks arising from a no-deal Brexit?
Let's start that. First, the FPC in its statement was fulfilling its statutory responsibilities to, first to Parliament, but ultimately to the people to identify the major risks to financial stability. So we had adjusted the language as we got closer to the potential date of no deal and these financial stability risks crystallizing. So it was making clear the issue. We, as embedded in your question, and as you know, Mr. Streeting, we have direct channels with the European authorities, particularly with the ECB, as part of the technical working group that Sir John just referenced. I would say that that's been a very effective forum. We've had good evidence-based discussions, evidence brought from both sides, evidence brought in from the industry. We provided an interim report to the Commission and to Her Majesty's Treasury on the issues. As you would glean from the statement of the Commission last week and the analysis of the FPC, there is some difference of opinion between us and the European authorities in terms of the potential financial stability risks. There's agreement around the risks for clear derivatives. That's what's welcome, and we're encouraged by the progress there. But there is a difference of opinion in terms of the risks around unclear derivatives, which are, in our judgment, material, and they would grow particularly. This is one of those issues which is everything is absolutely correlated. In other words, it's irrelevant if we have a deal. It's irrelevant if there's a long transition. It becomes very relevant if we don't have a deal, because that's a financial stability event. It's an event where you have higher market volatility. It's an event where firms need to turn over, dynamically hedge or adjust their derivative positions quite rapidly. And that's exactly the situation where many of the so-called, sorry for the jargon, life cycle events in the derivative contracts cannot be performed, and that knowledge creates risks. And this is the one area which I referenced in my comments earlier, which in our judgments, and I think the industry's judgment, and we have a lot of experience with similar situations on a much smaller scale, in our judgment, would take years for the private sector to self-solve. In other words, to close out the contracts or novate the contracts over to an entity that was more permanently authorized by European authorities. So that's the biggest point of where there's a difference of opinion that persists.
And in terms of sort of timeliness, both of resolving that kind of difference, a sort of marked difference of opinion in a particular area, but in terms of sort of trying to overcome that unhelpful difference, and also to get authorities in the right place to tackle some of the wider challenges around cross-border derivatives, data transfers. I think the FPC said the need for authorities to complete mitigating actions is now pressing. What were you thinking in terms of the time scales to resolve some of these issues? How quickly do we need to see
the issues around clear derivatives? The first issue Sir John was just referencing. I think in your previous testimony you referenced time frames of
It will have to be done by early to mid-December.
Yeah.
There'll have to be enough certainty about the form of the legal instrument.
But just if the agreement were to be approved by Parliament and with the transition period in, then that
falls away.
Okay.
That falls away. Yeah.
Sorry, Governor.
And then that falls away, and then the question becomes, under the future partnership, is what form of equivalence might be granted to for which activities, and that presumably, again, in that 20-month period, would, if that were determined, then you would move forward from there.
I mean, that sort of leads me on to my final question, really, which is, it's obviously reassuring that the FPC's across this, that you're engaged in discussions with your counterparts, with relevant authorities, to try and mitigate against the financial stability risks, as well as the wider risks associated with a no-deal scenario. Some people might glean from your evidence and testimony that therefore no deal is a plausible, perfectly reasonable way forward. It's all okay because the Bank of England and the powers that be across the European Union will mitigate against risks, and so it will be okay. To what extent do you think no-deal preparations are an adequate replacement for a full transition period? Would be my first question. And you've obviously, and understandably, I'm not sort of criticising the FPC for escalating the language around no deal, pointing to the risks, making sure that we're prepared, because it's quite right to prepare for the worst case scenario. But can you really envisage, not simply because of what Rishanara said about the lack of a parliamentary majority for a no deal scenario, but can you really envisage any responsible government, either on this side of the Channel or across the EU27, really allowing a no deal scenario to occur, knowing what that would mean for financial stability, for the wider economy in this country, in the European Union, and for our citizens? Would any responsible government really allow no deal to take place?
In terms of your first question and the characterization, I think the important thing, and Sir John alluded to it earlier, the financial sector, our job is to put the financial sector in a position where it's resilient, where it can take a large shock, and this would be a large negative shock to the economy. No deal, no transition. Okay, there should be no doubt about that. The question is whether the financial sector is part of the problem or an element of the solution, whether it amplifies the shock or dampens it somewhat. We think we put it in a position, we'll elaborate more next week as the FPC, where it would dampen and be there for the real economy. Now, but that is not the same thing as saying it'll all be all right. An unprecedented supply shock that would have elements, and I think this is something we haven't gotten into today, and I'm sure we would maybe in the future, but that has both temporary and more persistent components. So temporary components, think, the trucks at Dover and some of the friction costs in the immediate short term. Others are better placed than us to testify, although we've been spending a reasonable amount of time on these issues. The more permanent, or permanent from a medium term perspective, issues are around lost access to a major market or to major suppliers, and therefore how does a business reorient itself, and that takes time. It means that some of your capital and unfortunately potentially some of your workers may be stranded. That's a polite word, but it wouldn't be a polite, it wouldn't be a happy situation to be in. And during that period of time, there was a reduction, all things being equal, in the supply capacity of the economy. That means lost output, it means lost jobs, it means lower wages, it means higher inflation, all things being equal. So now, financial sector is okay. Not making it worse, that's what we can most directly influence, but we shouldn't downplay it. In terms of your last question, it's obviously a tricky one to answer. It's not in the interests of either party. There would be an economic shock in Europe as well, particularly in Ireland. It's not an interest in any of the parties. But our job is not to make the political calculation or mistakes happen sometimes, events, people run out of time, things can happen. And so we need to be in a position that if we ended up with no deal, no transition for whatever reason, either by choice or by accident, that we can give the assurance and the valid assurance that the financial system will be there.
Might just support that with a point on stress tests. We stress test the major banks every year against a severe but plausible event in which they take very large losses, and yet they still are able to stay above their regulatory thresholds, and they have enough capital to continue lending to the economy rather than do what they did during the financial crisis, which is just delever and drive the economy down, making everything worse. But they do take large losses in the stress case, and as when we publish the stress test results, you'll be able to see the losses the banks take on different portfolios. In order to be sure that the stress test encompassed a range of adverse Brexit outcomes, we constructed a severe adverse Brexit outcome, which will be in the papers we produce for in the FSR and then for the committee, to make sure that they could take those losses and continue to support the economy and not fall over in the way they did. But it's not they don't pass smoothly through. This is a test to see if they can take losses and then continue lending. And on financial stability risk, I think we've done everything we can to mitigate the risk of no deal, no transition. There are a range of other issues which didn't come to the financial stability level that we're monitoring as well, that we would have to deal with. But clearly, avoiding the situation where one has to deal with must be beneficial for financial stability at least.
Can I just make one point to just quickly bring it to financial markets, which is that one of the things we've seen when expectations of no deal have gone up in recent weeks is that there's movements in sterling, Mr. Elphick alluded to, but also movements in bank equity prices. And what's happened in general has been obviously a fall in bank equity prices and their price-to-book ratio, but not an increase in their borrowing spreads, not a material increase in the borrowing spreads. It shows two things. One, an expectation of the market that in a no-deal scenario there would be reduced profits or outright losses by those institutions, and therefore they're marking down those. But that the solvency, the health, the resilience of those institutions would remain robust in a no-deal senorio, and that is not something we saw. We saw both of them going the wrong direction, obviously, in the run-up to the financial crisis.
Can I just, I'm going to move on to Catherine in a minute, but can I just pick up, Sir John, on your point also about stress tests? As the banks sustain large losses but carry on lending, but they don't have to carry on lending. I mean, one of the problems was actually the banks might well have been able to lend, or certainly in terms of recovery, being able to lend, and yet businesses across, and you must pick this up in your agents' reports, businesses still report difficulty in getting money out of banks or that relationship of trust. Would you agree that just because they can carry on lending doesn't mean they actually would do? And that is critical. If they don't, that's critical for the health of the economy.
Yeah, I think there's a progression of things here. The reason they didn't lend during the crisis, first and foremost, was they were going through a life-threatening experience. Yeah. And if they didn't get their balance sheet down, they weren't able to cut lending and the like, they would not have enough capital and they would fail, and some of them did fail. So I think when you're in that extreme situation, the delivery is very sharp and very fast. The aim is to give them capital and liquidity buffers, and to ensure their asset quality in a way that they do not have to do that again. There's then a separate issue about what the demand for lending would be. So I assume that in our stress test scenario, the demand for borrowers' demand will go down, because if there's an economic hit, people aren't keen to invest, and households aren't so keen to borrow. Their savings go up. But the issue for us is to put them in a position where they can do that, and where they can absorb these shocks without going into, I would say, sort of panic cutback mode, which for me is the definition of the kind of financial stability crisis
Yeah.
that we saw.
Okay, thank you. Catherine.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to continue along the theme of no deal and some of the warnings that have been coming out. I know that the Chair already touched upon this, but earlier this year, Dr. Carney, you suggested that the possibility of a no-deal Brexit was uncomfortably high. However, in the inflation report, it says that a no-deal Brexit is an unlikely tail scenario. Which is it currently? Or where is it on that
where
spectrum?
Is it currently? It's uncomfortably high. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, if
yeah.
I may, Ms. McKennell,
No, that was fine.
No, that's fine.
It's that in the inflation report, in our forecast, we do not have a no-deal scenario as part of the conditioning assumptions. That's
fine. The inflation report, the latest one, does also put in some quite severe warnings about a no-transition Brexit. There'll be delays at the borders, disruptions to supply chains, and severe impairment of the productivity capacity of UK business, and a large immediate drop in supply. And this has been referred to in various answers. Can you just clarify on what basis those forecasts are being made, just for clarity? But also, there's been a lot of focus today on the immediate short-term impact. But if you could just clarify what the longer-term impact of that would be as well.
Yeah. Well, all those questions are bang on point, and they're going to be very relevant for the scenario. If I can stress scenario as opposed to forecast, that we will provide this committee next week as the MPC. Pick up on a couple of points. One is this issue of shorter-term disruption and longer-term adjustment to supply. So shorter-term disruption, the lorries at Dover, people not being familiar with what they need to do to prove rules of origin, uncertainty about whether the goods, product standards are going to be grandfathered in Europe or not, a decision of the European authorities. This is all in a no-deal scenario. Those types of issues become relevant. And this is one of the challenges from a monetary policy perspective. It will be to distinguish between shorter-term disruptions to supply and longer-term effects of a new trading relationship. And for a period of time, as I said earlier, a need to reallocate capital and labor to different sectors that are competitive under new trading arrangements. Also for foreign direct investment, their adjustment to those trading arrangements and the impact of the new arrangements on the labor supply. All judgments that we would need to make, and I think with our intention is to expose those judgments or the orders of magnitudes of those, the relevant orders of magnitude of those. One of the key questions in terms of making a judgment about where the economy could go over the course of the next few years in a no-deal scenario is the speed with which and even with a deal, ultimately, when you transition to a deal, the speed with which the economy adjusts. So if I could, I'll make the point this way. This is for the longer-term adjustments, medium-term adjustments to supply. We have a long experience with increased openness, increased integration built up over the course of the last 40, 50 years. So one can look at case studies, one can do econometrics, one can see relationships between openness and the impact on trade, on foreign direct investment, implicitly on productivity, growth, wages, etc. This will be for a time, depending on the fullness of time on what new relationships were struck, but a process of de-integration, of reducing openness. And the question is there symmetry in those relationships? Does productivity slow at the same pace that it grew, with de-integration as it grew with integration? Is the adjustment of labor markets as fast or as slow? Are things front-loaded, or do they happen over time? Those will give different economic, there are different economic implications for those. Now, we have some, how will we make those judgments, both in terms of producing scenarios and in real time? You rely on some evidence. You acknowledge the shortcomings of that evidence, because it's all evidence from one direction, not from another. You rely on talking to businesses, which we do, and we have very comprehensive business relationships, business surveys. Others do as well. We have to rely on in terms of, and I'll stop here, with respect to shorter-term frictions. I mean, we're taking judgments of those at the front lines of HMRC, of the Border Force, talking to broader government, informed by judgments including of the NAO. In terms of preparedness of businesses, Mr. Saunders referenced this earlier. I think it's fair to say that in general, most businesses have not activated contingency plans in the country. And it's also fair to say that a substantial proportion of businesses do not have contingency plans at this present time for a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring Andy in as well So there are a couple of questions, but also requests, because the report that you have referenced, that you stated that will be published in terms of analysis of the Brexit withdrawal deal. So you referenced Dover. Now, one of the issues that it's often referred to, and understandably so, it's very iconic in terms of port, but there are obviously ports all around the country. And from what I have heard, there doesn't appear to have been as much analysis, if any, done of the impact on ports, for example, in the northeast, where 60% of our goods are exported to the EU. And so I'd be interested to know if your report is going to focus not just on Dover and the more talked about visible economic impacts, but also the differentiating impacts on different parts of the country, and not just short term, but longer term as well. And has some assessment been done on that? And are we to anticipate that within your report?
Is that Mr. Haldane?
Well, both, because I think they're
let's have Mr. Haldane have a say. We'll give the Governor a break for a moment. But it's about regional particularly regional differentiation.
Well, generally the anticipated shock, in terms of the previous question I raised, but adding in an aspect of how that may actually impact upon different parts of the country in different ways, and also for longer term than other parts of the countries.
Right. I mean, one distinguishing feature of the sort of scenario we're going to play through is that this cannot be conducted from 30,000 feet. Some of the shocks to the economy we think about can be done from 30,000 feet. This is one that cannot be. So we are going through this in a degree of sectoral, granular detail to fully understand what the consequences might be, both shorter term and longer term, as the Governor set out. I understand the focus on Dover. I think Charlie would know, this is his constituency. I mean, it accounts for more than half, I think, of all heavy goods transit. So I get why there's been a focus there. We'll be taking intelligence not just on how it might affect Dover, but how it might affect other ports as well, when building up our own picture of how severe the choke points might be at all ports around the country. We'll be drawing very extensively on our regional agency network to do that. They have, our agents have in the field, as we speak, and have had for the past month, a survey of their company contacts that's asking them to look at how their business model might be reshaped, how their outputs and jobs might be altered by a deal versus no deal. And that intelligence will be a very important source feeding into the report that you'll get on the 29th of this month. We won't, I don't think, look to break that down on a regional basis. That I think would be a step too far for our analysis. I'm not sure our analysis could quite take the weight of that right now. But to be clear, it will be built up from a combination of both qualitative and quantitative evidence at a very granular sectoral level.
What I say, just to supplement that, is that we have these bigger relationships between openness, trade, productivity, foreign direct investment, all that. And that can provide rigor to the overall impact on the economy and the macroeconomic variables, growth, unemployment, most importantly inflation, that are relevant to the bank's responsibilities, and relatedly to asset prices such as house prices, which relate to the Financial Policy Committee's responsibilities. So we provide that. Then you have this set of information that Mr. Haldane just referenced that provides a cross-check or a perspective on those macro relationships. Because if I can just underscore the point, I fully recognize and visited, spent plenty of time in the Northeast. I appreciate its importance. But all our responsibilities are for the United Kingdom as a whole. And so we do, in the end, in making the policy judgments, which is what, in the end, you care about from the Bank of England, where interest rates are going to go for the country as a whole. How are we going to get inflation back to target, keep it at target for the country as a whole? How are we going to keep the financial system robust, resilient for the country as a whole?
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to bring it up to that level. So it won't be a set of regional assessments, as you said.
No.
Yeah.
Can I just... the committee's asked me this before, so I might just repeat the answer that I gave.
Or we could just look it up.
Well, you could, you might not find it because there's a lot of it. I seem to have used a lot of words. Yeah. To understand at each sector how the economic relationships are disrupted on particular assumptions about no-deal Brexit, I think goes further than the central bank could do. And actually the sectoral analysis, not trying to pass the buck here, but the sectoral analysis is for government that has departments of state that actually deal with pharmaceuticals, energy, agriculture, fisheries, and the like. So we can do, as the governor says, the top down, and as Andy has said, cross-check on the bottom up. But I think to look to us for that detailed sectoral analysis, which then feeds into a geographic regional analysis, I think there are other organs of state.
Well, we have our committee specialists looking at the government's own model, so that's a very good point to feed in.
Yeah, and obviously I recognise that is not your role, but obviously it is ours. And that feed into it is helpful. I just had one final question, and Rishnara referenced, are we between a rock and a hard place, which is quite a hard question to open with. But I wonder if you might, because your analysis of the withdrawal agreement, is going to be pretty key. And I appreciate your position that it's your role to highlight where some of the difficulties arise. But in terms of your base level, and you've referenced in terms of your the range with which you're predicting, and that the higher ranges would reference the status quo, but would that be will that be made clear within your analysis? Because Parliament has been mandated now, the Treasury, to reference its analysis of the withdrawal agreement and its economic impact with reference to the Prime Minister's own stated political position that there are three potential scenarios ahead of us, which is no deal, the negotiated deal, or remain. And presumably, therefore, it would be helpful for your own analysis to take the same framework in order for it to be the most useful for parliamentarians and the public to be able to make an analysis of the economic impact of all of these very important decisions that we are taking.
Earlier on, didn't we? So this is only to add from earlier on. Yeah.
Well, I just...
didn't know the answer earlier on. Okay, Catherine Stinsing, you're going to give a different answer.
I think you'd like a different answer. Let me try my same answer again, which is... how does this sound? The forecast... it's transparent.
We'll ask you again when you come back before us next time.
May 2016, the MPC at the time had a forecast for the economy, which was conditioned as always. We always condition on government policy. Government policy was to remain. And so we had a view at that time of what the potential growth of the economy would be. And effectively, one can just extrapolate that potential growth as the reference point of a remain. That is it's a clear, straightforward, transparent, consistent over time. Doesn't mean it's necessarily right, but reference point for the various scenarios that would be presented.
Okay. We're going to move on to a broader economic outlook, but I just I've got a couple of specific monetary policy questions we haven't covered, so Stuart, if you'll just bear with me for 2 questions. Mr. Saunders, I think I'm going to pick on you to answer these questions, and your colleagues to say if they've got a different view. The first one was about the MPC's forecast that's got inflation at target in 3 years' time, but with the economy still in excess demand. Does that imply that the bank thinks that the rate was going to have to rise to a higher level than the 1.5% currently envisaged in the forecast?
Well, that forecast has, as you said, the economy in excess demand 2-3 years out. And so the implication of that is that inflation pressures will probably continue to build over time. So you can imagine that off stage, if you like, inflation would be above target.
Yeah.
So if everything were to play out in line with that, then I think it's likely that interest rates over time would need to rise further, yes.
And the second question was about the MPC minutes noting that you've yet to incorporate the impact of the latest budget in your forecast. But we know we've obviously had evidence on the budget, particularly from the OBR, who say that the budget amounted to a, quote, substantial fiscal loosening. So in your next forecast, which presumably, I don't know if Mr. Haldane also has a view on this, which will include the budget decisions, is that likely to affect the committee's view on inflation and interest rates?
Well, it'll feed through to the growth outlook. Of course, we've taken in the context of all other developments over that period, whatever the economy's done and whatever news we have on Brexit. But I think the previous budget plans, if you take the cyclically adjusted primary balance, they had a tightening of 0.2% of GDP in 2019. The new plans have a loosening of 0.3%, so a swing of 0.5% of GDP in that year. The OBR's judgment is that adds 0.3 to GDP growth in 2019. We haven't yet done our full analysis of all of this, but if you would take that as a starting point, I think the direction of the fiscal effect on growth is clear, even if I'm going to be a little fuzzy on the exact scale of the impact.
Okay.
We'll look at that in December in the context of the round. And of course, fiscal's not all that's happening.
Yeah.
We've seen some pretty chunky moves in asset prices as well. I mean, the interest rate expectations, 3 years hence, are 25 basis points lower than they were in our conditioning assumptions in our last inflation report. So all of that will be folded in when we update our forecasts.
Okay, all right, thank you. So let's look at a wider economic outlook. Stuart.
Thank you. Slightly conscious of time, so I'll try and rattle through some of these. Governor, the MPC has been forecasting that economic growth would rotate away from household consumption to trade and investment. But the last minutes suggested demand was being supported to a greater extent by household consumption and less by business investment than had previously been expected. So does the UK remain overly reliant on consumption to drive growth, and has this become more precarious as the household financial balance has turned negative?
Right. You're absolutely right in that over the course of the last couple of quarters, business investment, in fact, over the course of the last year, business investment growth has been lower than we'd expected. In fact, it's fallen over the course of the time. And substantial evidence, I won't detail it all, but substantial evidence that that's largely a Brexit effect. All the other conditions are in place for actually quite strong investment growth. And I would say in defense of businesses, it's entirely understandable. There's the maximum uncertainty. They're going to get greater certainty relatively short order. And we would expect investment to pick up, as we do have in the forecast. It has meant that households have shouldered more of the load. I would say that in general, and the committee observes this, that in general households are consuming out of income. They're not consuming out. This is not a debt-fueled consumption boom. We have seen the pace of household credit growth has continued to slow. Consumer credit growth within that has slowed. Actually, in terms of overall household balance sheets now, albeit starting from a difficult position several years ago, they have continued to improve. And so I'll give you just one data point on that.
Yeah, sure.
People with debt service above 40%, which is a sort of threshold for vulnerability, pre-crisis 2.5%, It was 1.4% precisely a year ago. It's now 0.9% of households. So there has been this improvement. So yes, the consumer's taking more of the load, but I wouldn't point that there's a fundamental imbalance there.
Okay, so there's not a fundamental imbalance, but as you've said and the inflation report said, uncertainty around Brexit has probably reduced business investment.
Yes.
But the other evidence we've received, and not least from Ray Newton-Smith at the CBI, suggested that there was little in the way of pent-up investment that could be released if and when a withdrawal agreement is finalised. So that would slightly contradict what you've said in the sense that, you know, the CBI themselves aren't suggesting there's a huge pent-up demand or a huge pent-up ability to invest sitting there.
Well,
where's the balance?
Look, we do think that there's upside to investment if greater clarity is provided. First point, and actually something which we're hoping to provide, be able to provide some color to the committee when we're next here, if we're invited back, which is that we have our agency network. Mr. Holden, I was dealing with this the other day, is out in the field with a Brexit survey of businesses, which is around precisely these questions. What will happen, no deal? What will happen with the deal, both in terms of investment, what they expect for activity and for employment. And the early returns on that indicate that it's quite asymmetric, not surprisingly. We do see that there's upside. May I say this, which is that in this forecast, in the November forecast, the level of investment in the economy is 14% higher at the end of the 3 years than it is today. So investment is important to the forecast. The forecast is conditioned on a smooth transition to some form of arrangement.
Indeed, and
so can I add something?
Sorry, yes, of course.
It's clear that there's been a significant adverse effect on business investment over the last couple of years from the Brexit vote. Right? If you take the period since Q2 of 2016, when we had the vote, business investment in the UK has risen by 1% in real terms. That's by far the weakest in the G7. The next weakest is Germany, which has had a gain of 6%. France, Italy and the US have all seen double-digit gains. Now, the withdrawal agreement may give us back some of that, but I suspect that quite a lot of that is a permanent loss.
And that's actually the point I wanted to make, because, Governor, you spoke about once there was greater clarity as to what happens, we may see an improvement. But insofar as the MPC forecast already assumes a smooth transition, is there really any scope for a, quote, deal dividend in terms of investment, given that if this is a smooth transition to something which is understood and understandable, as opposed to a disruptive or disorderly, I'm struggling to see where the upside comes, although sadly I can see an awful lot of downside.
Well, you're right, and that's why I referenced the growth of investment over the 3 years. So the 14% pickup in the level of investment over the 3 years, that is with the smooth. Now, it's possible, particularly given, depending on the nature of the future economic partnership and the degree of clarity around that, and around the expectations around the length of the transition period, it's possible that
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It's possible that there's some upside from that, but there is more downside in terms of our judgment, my personal judgment, and I think will be what we're seeing with companies, and Andy can talk to this, Mr. Haldane can talk to this. There's more downside in terms of a no-deal Brexit than there is further upside from this forecast in terms of investment.
Okay, that's helpful.
I think in terms of
Mr. Haldane.
I think there is no symmetry, as the Governor says. Equally, Brexit notwithstanding, the cloud that's created notwithstanding, I think for a number of companies, the investment fundamentals are pretty strong right now. So, on average, the return a company would get from investing is in low double digits, and the cost of financing that investment is 2-3%. So the gap, the jaws between the return on capex and the cost of capex could be double digits. And that is, by any historical metric, a very strong incentive to get out and invest. So I do think, in our forecast we have some recovery in investment to around 5% or so. But I'd say, given the scale of those jaws, there is some upside there as well that we'd be wrong to discount.
Okay. In arithmetic terms, you're right, there's a gap. But if that investment is predicated on a market of 500 million people, which is now in doubt,
right,
then it's rather less attractive than the 3-4-5% gross margin might imply.
No.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But that's the that goes with, this is all part and parcel in terms of, and it's relevant relative to an old trend or previous trend of the economy relative to a new trend, which perhaps we can explore in more detail once we.
Mr. Sanders, just one final question for you. We've heard, I think you said the risk of no deal has become more visible to businesses. And, Governor, I think you suggested that a few companies are making contingency plans. Where are we now in terms of no deal contingency planning for business? And do businesses have enough time left to put in place plans that would actually be credible and be able to move swiftly enough, should we end up with a very disruptive Brexit next spring?
Well, in the financial sector, as the Governor has said, there's been a lot of preparedness. In the non-financial sector, which is what I was referring to, I said that many firms have not yet prepared for a no-deal Brexit. What I find talking to companies is great uncertainty about this. Many of them really are unsure as to how they should prepare. And are unwilling to spend large amounts on things which may turn out to be the wrong preparation or not necessary. And so I'm generally unsure as to how well prepared businesses could be for a no-deal Brexit. I doubt if it could be done in time.
Right, that's helpful, thank you.
Thank you very much. Simon.
Thank you very much, Chair. And gentlemen, I want to turn to the link between immigration and wages, which has obviously been the subject of considerable commentary in the light of the news that we got last week that the number of workers born in the EU fell by 132,000, while the number born outside the EU also declined. How far is that shift, Governor, likely to affect the relationship between pay and employment in the near and the long term?
Yeah, it's those are notable figures. And we'll look forward to the long-term immigration figures and the ONS figures on the flow. Those are figures on the stock and on the flow. But I think, given the size of the move, one would expect deceleration in labour supply growth. And will have sectoral implications for wages. We have expected for some time and have seen for some time a gradual firming of wages in the economy because the labour market as a whole is tightening, and we expect that to continue to happen. What we have seen in the past, and there's a fair bit of analysis, I think most recently referenced in our 2015 inflation report, but I'm thinking of Steve Nichols' work with Jumana Salihin, as an example too. When we look at, because your question about the long term, but actually over the inflation target horizon, so not even the long term, the medium term, the impact of this on inflation is what we have found, and quite rigorous studies, that the aggregate impact of this on inflation is very marginal, because the upward pressure on wages is accompanied with a reduction in aggregate demand as those workers move. The difference, in the other direction, there's more supply in the economy as more workers come in and there's more demand. So from memory, And we can, I'll write back for completeness and just give you the references and the detail, but it's on the margin. If it's 200,000, 250,000, that's what I'm hesitating on. It's around 0.1 on inflation. That sort of swing in migration. So on the aggregate, it's quite relevant in some sectors and some people's wages, but in the aggregate, it's marginal.
Which sectors are those, out of interest?
I'm sorry?
Which sectors are those that are particularly likely to be affected?
Those sectors where we're seeing pressure include the hospitality sector, the expectation in the agriculture sector as well. We're seeing some skills gaps building up in medicine and healthcare. Yeah.
So you'd expect any increase in wages to be concentrated
food pricing
there.
as well. Yeah, I mean, you'd see it first, and then it propagates. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of then the impact, based on what you're saying about the minimal impact on inflation, does that have a correspondingly minimal impact on likely changes to bank rate?
That specific aspect, yes.
Okay. Mr. Haldane, the economic forecasting in the inflation report suggests that migration might fall more sharply than perhaps the ONS itself has been projecting. If that risk is borne out, how is the forecast and expected path of bank rate likely to be affected by that? If there's, if you like, an acceleration above trend.
This is in rates of migration?
Yes.
So our conditioning assumption in the forecast is to take the ONS's projections of net migration. On their numbers currently, actually, rates of net inward migration are running slightly north of those projections. But the numbers you mentioned, the recent ones from the Labour Force Survey, which are more timely, they're covering up to Q3, whereas the ONS numbers only cover to Q1, do suggest some potential downside risks to those projections. I think when it comes to our next forecast round, we need to revisit our ONS projections in the light of the data that you mentioned.
Okay, that's really helpful. In terms of, actually, this is really, Sir John, to get your view on this. We've obviously now got a situation where the unemployment rate has seemingly levelled off in the region of 4%, and nominal growth in wages finally, after these years of really difficult, and well, in some cases no rises at all, we've finally got above the 3% level. Is that a sign that what, if you like, basic economics would tell us, that if labour availability tightens, that wages go up, is finally reasserting itself?
Yeah, one would hope so. And I think we've had two readings now above 3%, but also in the, I think, 16 or 17 months previously, on a shorter metric, 3 month on 3 month, it's clear that pay has established itself above the 2.5 limit. So we had periods end 2014, beginning 2015, I think, and again in 2016-17, where sort of pay went above for a couple of months and then came down again. We've had a longer reading now, which suggests that this is more established. And if you cross-check on other areas in the labour market tightness, job-to-job flows, quit rates, and the like, and our agent surveys all suggest that there is a firming there. Our forecast, I think, has pay moving into the threes kind of next year. So this is kind of evidence that would support the forecast.
Excellent. Mr. Saunders, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. Inward migration to the UK has been a major source of a boost to potential growth over the last few years. And it's because it adds to growth in the workforce, and it's added to skills in the workforce. Remember that foreign workers in the UK, on average, a higher share of them have been to university, have tertiary education, than the homegrown workforce, if you like. And so a drop in inward migration, if that is indeed what we're seeing, would mean lower potential growth in the economy. It might also mean lower actual growth. Fewer workers, it would be a blow for consumer spending. So you can see sectors which would be worst affected might be consumer-facing sectors that rely on foreign workers in their staff. I don't think that has I don't think that has any great implications either way on the inflation outlook. Right, you'd reduce both supply and demand in the economy more or less equally, and by extension, it doesn't have any great implications for monetary policy either.
But on wages specific, on a narrow issue of wages, you would accept that there is almost certainly some kind of correlation between...
No, the reason why pay growth is picking up is not because inward migration is lower, it's because the labour market is tight. The jobs rate is the lowest for more than 40 years. The number of vacancies is at a record high. Surveys suggest that recruitment difficulties are high and widespread across all sectors. These trends were there a year ago. They have intensified since then.
That's really helpful. And Dr. Carney?
Yeah, the general picture, I associate myself with everything Mr. Saunders just said. The general picture of firming wages is one we have expected for a while. We're seeing it. I personally would expect it to continue, conditioned on the assumption of some sort of smooth transition to a relatively close partnership. I will say, I'll just pick up on something Mr. Haldane said about an hour ago, which is, and the committee observed this in the minutes, we do expect some short-term volatility in economic data. There have been some big swings. There's softness in retail sales. There's issues with investment. This is an unusual quarter, and depending on what happens, we'll look through. We'll see what happens. We'll see how the data comes out. But
it feels more than just ephemeral, though.
It feels, as I think you started with, sort of basic economics. At some point, the Phillips curve kicks in, and that we have a tight labor market. And I would stress one other point, if I could, which is that. In an economy where productivity growth is, our forecast has it getting up to around 1%, just a little more than 1%, then 3.25%, 3.5% wage growth is consistent with the inflation target. So that has a bearing directly on the stance of policy.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Haldane, you gave a speech last month, and it was quite interesting, but I suppose because that has implications for sort of responsible trade unionism, and you highlighted the fact that lower unionisation and flexible working are reducing workers' pay power. Has that had an impact, do you think, on the real wages of some or all workers, and perhaps by sector?
I think that was in the context of thinking about pay, not just in sort of the cyclical terms we've been describing for the last 5 minutes.
Yes.
Tightness in
But
labour market.
long-term
structural factors bearing upon it, of which unionisation and collective bargaining are one. The other two I mentioned were automation in the workforce, which is actually and prospectively could have a significant bearing on bargaining power of workers too, as might the degree of concentration in the labour market. In other words, if there were large employers exercising greater power over their workers. In the UK case, actually, the second and third of those factors, automation and concentration, appear to have been less potent than in other countries. The first, where we have seen a secular fall in degrees of unionisation and collective bargaining over time, do appear to have had a greater bearing, but earlier on. I'm talking 70s and 80s rather than 90s and noughties. So I think there is a factor there. It is slow moving. It has been significant, but that headwind currently is being more than counterbalanced by the cyclical tailwind we've been describing, and that's what's taking pay up. In some sectors, has it affected things? Yes, I think it probably has.
Yes, I suppose there's a chance that there's a two-tier labour market developing, because you highlight in your speech that people who don't switch jobs aren't benefiting from wage improvement in the same way that those who do. So have we entered effectively sort of compare the market style world where unless you are really quite quick to move jobs, then you can be at risk of significant wage stagnation?
So I'd make 2 points here, if I may. First, on those that move versus those that stay in post. A striking feature of the past few years has been, despite the tightening of the labour market, the pay of those that have stuck in work has not picked up as much as you might expect. Or put differently, employers haven't felt the need to pay up to retain workers. I would say over the last 6 to 12 months we've seen that picture altering. That such has been the tightness of the labour market, that companies have felt the need to pay up those existing workers just to retain them, given skill shortages.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Which would help. One last point, because your other point was about, do we, however, have a two-tier bifurcated labour market? I think on that, there is some evidence of that being the case. I haven't looked at it. By which I mean, you think of there being two pools of companies. those with high productivity and those with low productivity, and two pools of workers, those with high skills and those with low skills. What you do find in the UK, to a greater extent than elsewhere, is that the high-skilled workers tend to swim in the high-productivity firm pool and vice versa at the lower end. And that's important when we're thinking about longer-term productivity prospects, because people moving job from low to high-productivity firms and back again is one of the mechanisms, key mechanisms through which ideas diffuse and disseminate.
That's exactly right, which is one reason why cyclically this higher job-to-job movement is positive. It's finally recovered and it's positive for productivity.
Well, that moves us very well on actually to Alison, I think, is going to raise the productivity.
I am. And before I do so, I just had one brief question following up from what previous people had asked about the shock that might be caused by a withdrawal from the European Union without any sort of agreement. Governor, isn't this a sort of strange situation in that normally much of the impact of economic shock will come from the fact that it's unexpected, therefore not planned for, so that people's expectations are confounded in some way by some event that had previously been unexpected. And isn't this idea that we're all talking about the most predicted, planned for economic shock that we've seen? So will this be a shock or not?
Yeah, well, I think it was Ms. Ali's questioning earlier about responsible governments, and is this possible to happen? I mean, there has been an expectation since the referendum, and I think a revealed expectation of businesses and households up and down the country that there won't be a shock, disorderly Brexit. In some cases, and I agree with one of my colleagues who said earlier that there are some contingencies for which companies can't plan around. If there's clogged ports, if there's other issues, they can't plan around that. But the fact is that a substantial proportion of companies in a very wide range of sectors don't have contingency plans for a hard Brexit next spring. So in that regard, it would be a shock, first point. The second is that the behavior of businesses directionally has been for some reduction, some uncertain level, but some reduction of openness, which is part of the reason why investment has been lower. And financial markets, for what it's worth, it is worth something. They have been anticipating a shock and have been pricing some possibility of this shock, but it's not as the most likely scenario. So it still has the potential, as is being realized, for being a shock.
Okay. To come back to productivity in that case, Andy, you have sort of started to get onto the question that I think a lot of people are wondering about in relation to productivity, which is where is Britain's productivity problem? And there does seem to be a bit of disagreement around. Is it?
Short answer.
Just cover that in 5 minutes. That'd be great. Thank you.
So, for a long time, we've had this narrative of the long tail that we have, quite a high number of low productivity firms. I presume that's the kind of like low skill, low productivity bit of the bifurcation that you were just referring to. But a recent Bank Underground blog that we all obviously read religiously on this committee says that in fact they can't be to blame for the slowdown in growth, and there does seem to be some suggestion that actually it's more the most productive firms ceasing to be as productive as they have been that's actually to blame. So who is to blame for low productivity? Andy Holland.
I wouldn't be assigning blame, but I can give you an attempt at explanation if that helps. A few facts. So, I mean, all countries have a long tail of firms, productivity-wise. It just so happens the UK is materially longer than most of our competitor countries. So the gap between, the best and the rest in the UK is 50% larger than it is in Germany or France. Kind of case in point. Second fact, that tail has become materially larger during the course of the crisis than it has in those same competitor countries. Third, how do you reconcile that with the blog that you mentioned? It's fantastic that you're an avid reader of Bank Underground. Well, the answer lies in how you define the tail. Because the truth is, the very frontier companies, let's call it the top 5%, the top 10%, they haven't suffered any productivity slowdown or flatlining or puzzle at all. For them, the fourth industrial revolution is alive and kicking. They are growing in productivity terms as rapidly as at any point that I can find in history, actually. Where the slowdown has come has been those just off the frontier. Let's call them the second decile companies, which are big, historically have been successful, and the blog talks about how they have been the biggest single cause and casualty of the crisis in terms of their levels of productivity slowing down. We have had the head of the pack pulling further away, and those just behind the head of the pack lagging further behind, and indeed joining that long tail. So when I talk about the long tail lengthening, that's what I mean. Those that would have been the dog have now joined the tail. And that reconciles, I hope, my stuff. To mix my metaphors.
Well, you have all sorts of charities complaining about that or something.
I thought that was perfectly clear. Just a couple of more detailed questions. Where does the size of the service sector play into this in terms of the British story? Because some of the areas in which it's most hard to find productivity gains, for example, in social care, in those firms that are operating in a world where there is not a lot to be gained from technological advance, what work has undergone to unpick what is going on in those firms where actually productivity gains are quite hard to find, and also they represent the kind of everyday economy, whether it's social care or hospitality. Retail is a bit mixed, but what work is going on to work out in that big chunk of the British economy, whether it's even possible for there to be significant productivity gains?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So is the composition, the sectoral composition of the UK economy, does it mean that it's naturally inclined to be less amenable to productivity growth by dint of being more service sector oriented? I don't think that comes close, and we've looked at this in quite some detail, to explaining either the slowdown over the last 10 years or the gap between the UK and competitor countries. It might help a bit in explaining the second, the international gap, but doesn't really explain the flatlining over the last 10 years. And if we shout out to my colleague Silvana Tenrerio, who's looked at this and assigns, I think it's between half and 2/3 of the slowdown as being focused in manufacturing financial services, which which had been significant contributors to the pickup in productivity, the growth of productivity pre the crisis. So I think it helps on the gap with our international competitors, but doesn't really help us in explaining the flatlining of the last 10 years.
Okay, that's really interesting, and no doubt we'll pick that up with her when she comes before us at some point in the future. Just to come back briefly to wages, just to be clear, my colleague Simon Clark just now was, I think, driving at whether the low immigration was helping with the wage picture. We got kind of a mixed answer, but could I just ask about the sort of second order effects? what is in the forecasts if, as wage growth picks up, the consequences in terms of the overall labour market? Like, what do we expect the impact of that to be on the broader labour market?
Falls in migration.
Well, I might invert it a bit, which is to say that the tightening of the labour market, we have in our forecast some small further reduction in unemployment. I would generally recognize what Mr. Clark said in terms of the unemployment rate stabilizing around this level, but for what it's worth, in our forecast we have a small further tightening, further growth in hours worked. That tightening with more limited labor supply growth for many reasons leads to, and with productivity, a small pickup in productivity, we see wage growth going from the low 3s to around 3.5% on an average hourly basis by the end of the forecast horizon.
So you think there will be growth in hours worked?
We do, yeah. We do. I mean, because we have the economy, again, a point we were discussing earlier, again, subject to the conditioning assumptions around this forecast, we have the economy continuing to move into excess demand, and so running a little higher than capacity, to say it in a different way, and the consequence of that is, one of the consequences of that in the labor market is a further firming of wages. And as Mr. Saunders said a while ago, prospectively off stage, a pickup of inflation above target beyond the forecast horizon.
And do you have an understanding of, in terms of that pickup in hours worked, like how that's going to come? Is that going to be about everybody seeing an increase in hours worked, or a particular group of people within?
I mean, we don't go down to that sort of sectoral level. So just an overall.
So in that set, basically, a lot of the questions about the bifurcation of the labour market are essentially unanswered, because you might imagine that some of the people who are working part-time because of caring responsibilities in low-skilled, low-productivity growth jobs are the sort of people who might also not see their hours increase as the pickup happens. But what you're saying is the bank doesn't really focus on that.
So can I come in on this? Right? So the trend which we've seen over the last year is that overall job growth has slowed a little bit. It's at 1% year to year. But in the last few months, self-employment is down, the number of part-time workers is down, and the numbers of people in temporary work is down. The numbers of people who are full-time employees, which, if you like, is the most stable form of work, is actually up 2.5% year to year. It's substantially stronger than the growth of overall employment. And so if your two-tier workforce is between sort of part-timers, temps and self-employed and the rest, actually we're sort of seeing a shift between those tiers into the more secure forms of work.
Yeah.
And finally, just one last question just on the sort of broader future. We haven't talked that much about automation, but it's obviously one of the big shifts that Mr. Clark and I asked about. So which problem is more pressing for the UK? Is it machines taking people's jobs, or people stuck doing jobs that could be done more effectively by machines?
There's a bigger problem. Look, I think this is an area where we have done a fair bit of analysis. I expect we will continue to do so. Mr. Haldane's talked about it. I've talked about it. We've looked at these transitions in history of whether it's, I mean, today it's around machine learning, previously other technological innovation, and how long they take, orders of magnitude, and what can be done to speed them up. And then associated, what does that mean for the overall level of interest rates? What does it mean, how much of that is relevant over the policy horizon? Best as we can tell, the orders of magnitude of the fourth industrial revolution are similar to the previous ones. So they're big, but they're not insurmountable in terms of finding new forms of work, and it's a question of whether we have the institutions to help with those transitions. Probably the biggest problem would be to lean against it unnecessarily. This is an area in many respects where the United Kingdom has real competitive advantages, and so the question is, how are we going to upskill? And maybe I should end it here. I know time's short, but from the financial sector perspective, what are we doing, or what sort of general purpose financial infrastructure that's the responsibility of the bank in terms of either how we approach supervision, how we run our payment system, other things. What do we do to help unlock some of the financial innovation that would finance the companies, that would create new jobs, that would mean that this transition is more effective, and there would be more people, if I'm following the two classes of worker theme here, that are in the first class, the productive class.
Thank you. I've got two more questions. One is in terms of creating new jobs. Mr. Haldane, you have a new role. You are now chairing a new industrial strategy council, obviously relating to assessing progress on the industrial strategy. Just whether, I think I should ask whether you think there are any potential conflicts of interest with your role at the bank, or particularly being a member of the MPC, and perhaps the governor could say what discussions there have been about that appointment to that role in order to safeguard the bank's independence. Mr. Haldane, do you want to go first?
Very happy to. And it's an important question to raise. It's one we took very seriously and discussed internally, of course, before that appointment was announced. Discussed with Mark and discussed with the bank's own conflicts officer. We raised with the NPC as a collective. The key point here is that the council, this Industrial Strategy Council, is not in the business of setting or indeed designing industrial strategy policy. Its role is very clearly to evaluate the impact of the policies agreed by the government. So in that sense, there's no real conflict between the MPC's role in the setting of monetary policy and the Industrial Strategy Council's role in opining on the impact of, in this case, structural policies. But it's also worth mentioning, just in passing, this is a personal responsibility rather than a Bank of England one. That's true of all of the members of the council. They are there not as the chairperson of Marks & Spencer's, but as, in that case, someone with great experience in the corporate sector. And this will not involve any resource from the Bank of England either. It's purely my role. So those are the considerations that went into the deliberation we had internally ahead of this being announced. But Mark might want to say a bit more.
Just with respect to process, internal review by our conflicts officer, when we review as each of the committees whether any new role of a member of the committee could have a conflict, or an existing role evolves into having a conflict. And so we did as the MPC, and this was also reviewed by court. So we went through the process, and for the reasons of personal capacity, no bank resources, advisory, OBR-esque, if you will, and view that no conflict, and the vain hope that Mr. Haldane's knowledge of productivity would further improve, and there'd be some spillover benefits to our understanding of this important issue in the economy. I
suppose just a follow-up question to that is, obviously you're right about the view being that members of the MPC are not going to sort of endorse or criticise government policy, whereas by the sounds of it, the council is going to have to opine, which means saying something, presumably, about the success or otherwise of the overall industrial strategy. Do you feel you'll be able to, as a council, as a member of the council, pass comment on the industrial strategy without getting into being a member of the MPC and endorsing or criticising government policy?
Yes, I hope so, and yes, I think so. It isn't just me; it is a whole council with a wide and diverse range of experiences and backgrounds. You'll have seen from the composition, which is a crucial thing for me in taking up the chairmanship, I should say. And as I say, we are independent and arm's length from government. That's crucially important. And our recommendations, our publications will be open to external scrutiny, and will need to be objective and rigorous as possible. And I think that puts clear blue water between the MPC's role and the role of the council.
Okay, no, thank you. And then the final question was just going back to, I think I'm sure you enjoyed your session here today, and you've got another one coming up in not very long, once we've seen your report from next week. But you've mentioned rightly, quite a few of you have mentioned the agents' work that the bank, or the agents do on behalf of the bank, and I've been to one of the agents' meetings in Loughborough, and I know how important they are. Just about whether we might be able, as a committee, to have, presume you're going to mention some of the agents, the reports back as part of the report you give to us as a committee, whether there's an opportunity perhaps for more transparency than there would normally be in relation to agents' reports, whether we'll need to have more transparency in order to fully appreciate the basis on which the report is given to us, I suppose.
Sure. First thing, in terms of when we reference agents' reports, for example, in the inflation report, the agent reports come out at the same time. So they're a different place on the website, but they're there, trust it. And we can bring you to it. In terms of the specific issues around Brexit preparedness and the potential impact, the survey that literally is in the field, it was in the field for a subsequent policy round, it wasn't for these purposes. We will look to the possibility of having something. It won't be, it's actually finishing just on the day we're doing the report.
Right.
But depending on the time that we were back here, if we can get it in a position that it's rigorous enough to be published, then we would publish it, we'd provide it to the committee and publish it on the day that we appeared. I mean, if we can do it, we'll do that. So you have the same transparency as you have with the agent references in this report.
Okay. Lovely. Well, thank you all very much indeed for your time this morning. Very grateful for your evidence. And as I say, we look forward to seeing you for the committee soon. Thank you for now, everyone. I'm going to ask committee.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has